you basically said, I mean, you're basically saying, well, Austrian is just, you know, we're using an institutionalist argument and we're moving in a new direction, and neoclassical is moving in a new direction, but you've really not said anything as to why Austrian should be a different school or why it's a better school. I mean, I still don't see where even this argument's coming from.
I think anyone who asked me that question, right, which is a good question to ask, what you got to do is you got to spend time in another environment where economics is being done. And I did that. Bryan's done it. All right. I don't know how the hell Bryan did it and has the views that he does, because I know no one at Berkeley or Princeton that I might even describe as sensible, except for Ben Bernanke. But if you're in an environment where other people are thinking in certain ways, you realize that what goes on at George Mason and what you're taught here is far removed from what people refer to when they talk about quote-unquote mainstream economics. When you take intermediate micro here, it's the same, see, this is the thing that's tricky about Bryan. It's the same language and the same techniques. You have an indifference curve, you have budget constraints, you have rationality, you talk about all these things like that. But somehow, if it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Bryan is an Austrian economist. He's a duck. If you put this duck in some other environment, he'd be floundering because the other people around him wouldn't understand what the hell you meant by, you know, drawing the budget constraints certain ways in the indifference curves. All right, you know, people in here, even thinking about the application of those tools to political science was considered right, crazy. Right, it was considered crazy to apply those things to things. There's still departments that think that way. And if you go and get the U.S. News and World Report, you know, there's a lot of those departments that are still at the top of those things. All right, we had Gary Becker here a month ago. Gary Becker was asked, how do you keep a department great over time? Well, Gary Becker said, well, Chicago ain't great anymore. Why isn't Chicago great anymore? Because it ain't what it used to be in terms of those kind of questions it asks. It's a different place now. And so, you know, the economists think differently in terms of judgment and relevance. There's all kinds of questions outside of the technical tools. It's impossible for any person nowadays to claim that they're an Austrian economist that's not somehow messed up by neoclassical economics in a good way or a bad way, because you were all trained to be economists. Otherwise, you're certifiable. I mean, you're like, and everyone thinks I'm insane. No, that's the problem. But unless you went through, because you went through undergraduate school, you learned all about intermediate micro, then you go through 4 years of graduate school in which you're well versed in mathematics and learning the different tools and techniques, and naturally you blend those things. It's part of your intellectual milieu, all right? But you think differently than other economists. Austrians ask different questions. That's the main thing. They ask different questions.
So really your discussion is not a positive difference more than a normative difference. I mean, the things, when you're talking about neoclassical and the Harvard ideal, we start with these assumptions of perfect competition and these kind of silly assumptions, really, and that, well, the real world deviates, therefore we need governments. And really, to me, it seems like these people, and the people you're talking about who argue about socialism and how it was better, you know, way back in the 30s and the 40s and even up to the 80s, the reason why they came to these conclusions is not because they had these positive arguments and they came to a normative conclusion. They started with a normative ideology, and they justified themselves or rationalized themselves based on how they manipulated their numbers, essentially.
I don't want to dominate the thing, but I would argue the exact opposite. And the reason why I argue the opposite is precisely because the way the model sets up, it doesn't highlight the very things that make capitalism work. And so it's very easy for someone to not appreciate capitalism if the model that they are steeped in studying doesn't highlight those things. Like, for example, if outcomes are independent of whether or not private property rights are in existence. Joseph Stiglitz, who's probably the most brilliant economist of his generation, argues in streams of papers that property rights don't matter, competition does. And my view is that if you don't understand that property rights matter, because your model doesn't highlight that, then you're going to miss certain features of reality. And that's what I would argue this style of thought this certain style of thought, which, for the sake of the argument, we'll call neoclassical economics squared, not neoclassical economics a la Caplan, but neoclassical economics squared, that turns our eyes away from certain institutions which are necessary for the nature of capitalism to operate. And the Austrians never wanted you to turn your eye away from it. So in that regard, I think that Austrian economics is essential, but it has to progress. Can't just stay. I mean, I'll disagree real quickly with my professor, with my Israel Kirzner, who I have tremendous respect for more than Bryan does. But Israel Kirzner says around 1950, 1949 to put it exactly, for those of you in the know this, that economics reached its zenith, and that since this is how he draws the graph. Okay? He actually draws it like that. And I disagree with that in the sense that knowledge has to progress over time. Okay? Though I do think that this was a significant watershed in thought. And that all progress has to build off of that, but I don't think that it exhausts our knowledge.
Just to respond to a totally different part of that question. So at least my reading of your question was you were saying, well, what exactly is it that we disagree about? Because you're still unsure about this. And I think it's, especially after Pete's reply, it's reasonable to be unclear on it. You know, if I were to boil it down to one purity test, I'd say, Pete, do you reject radical uncertainty in all its forms, with all its empty promises? Right? And if you say yes, then I go, all right, fine, the debate's over, I'm satisfied. And if you say no, then you've been papering over what I think is this issue, which, while highly abstract and seemingly irrelevant, nevertheless leads Austrians off into this direction of lack of progress.
Well, no, I think that the key issue, I think the key issue there is, I know, but you said empty promises.
Yes.
I think you put it, of course, I reject the empty promises. Everyone, I don't like empty promises. I didn't beat my wife. You know, these kind of things. I want scientific progress, right? I don't want to have empty promises.
It's a joint statement.
Yeah.
You reject it in all its forms, with all its empty promises.
Not all its forms,
Okay.
but all its empty promises.
Right, so that's where I would say is the disagreement. He doesn't reject it. He still accepts it, although it wasn't part of his talk. But that still is what it is. It still is eating him up.
No, it's not eating up. It's over in here and coping with their ignorance.
This question is for Professor Caplan. If you're talking about probability theory so much, why are you spending all your time trying to convince these Austrians to give up their viewpoints if you don't seem to be having much success?
Well, let's see. I mean, of course, I have a finite amount of time, and I have several different ways I can apply it. Right, and it still seems to be more likely to succeed than many others. Right? In other words, there's many things you could try, even though you don't think you're likely to succeed. I can send papers to the American Economic Review, think I only have a 5% chance of success. Right, as long as the payoff is high enough, I can still do it. Right, and I'd say that arguing with Austrians is in a very similar vein. And also, I mean, I haven't been completely unsuccessful. I've gotten at least a couple of Austrians to back down on radical uncertainty. And so I'd say that's the motivation. You don't need 50% probability in order to make doing something worthwhile.
Well, I guess if you want to go into radical uncertainty, I think it really depends on your perception, doesn't it? Because from the point of view of the individual acting within his sphere, radical uncertainty is absurd on its face. Because everything I do, I have some idea of what I'm doing. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. The only time where I could see radical uncertainty makes a lot of sense would be from the point of view of the government or from someone trying to direct something. Because, you know, in the future, I have absolutely no idea what the future is going to look like 50 years from now. And to try to create, and to try to direct policy towards specific goals 50 years from now seems, again, really silly. And so radical uncertainty from the point of view of an institution makes a lot of sense in that the only thing you should be looking for in an institution is to develop a process to make sure that people are working in a right direction from the point of view of exchange and rights and so forth. And so in that sense, I can kind of agree with Boettke, but from the point of view of the individual and of individual entrepreneurs, I agree with you, because it doesn't make any sense. You put money into things you have an idea about. You don't put money into things that's like, oh wow, I'm totally uncertain. I'll pay money for that.
But whoever said that? See, this is